In 1849, a British archaeologist broke into a sealed chamber beneath the ruins of Nineveh. Inside were thousands of clay tablets, 4,000 years old, describing beings who came down from the sky and built the first cities on Earth. A century later, a shepherd threw a stone into a cave by the Dead Sea. The jar that shattered held scrolls that the Christian church had quietly stopped reading 1,000 years before. Scrolls describing beings who came down from the sky and taught humanity everything it knows. 2 discoveries, 2 languages, 2 civilizations that never met. The same beings, the same descent, the same list of forbidden knowledge, the same punishment, the same flood. No one has fully explained why. Tonight you don't need to explain it either. You just need to listen. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let your breathing slow. This story has waited 4,000 years. It can carry you gently, wherever you need to go. Let's begin. To understand why the parallels between the Book of Enoch and the Sumerian tablets matter, you have to understand where each of these texts came from. And to do that, you have to imagine a world without printing presses, without paper, without the assumption that words are cheap and easy to reproduce. You have to imagine a world in which writing was a sacred act, performed by specialists, in specific places, on materials that had to be prepared by hand, for purposes that were almost always either religious or administrative or both. Let's start with the older of the two. In the autumn of 1849, a British traveller and amateur archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was digging in northern Iraq on a low artificial mound that the local people called Kuyunjik. Layard was not, by modern standards, a careful excavator. He was a young man with a romantic streak and a great deal of energy and very little patience for the slow, methodical brushwork that defines archaeology today. He wanted to find things. He wanted to find things that would matter. And on Kuyunjik he did. What Layard had stumbled into, without quite knowing it, was the buried palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, the last great ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire who had reigned in the 7th century before the Common Era from the city of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal was, among other things, one of the only literate kings in the entire ancient Near East. Most kings of his era could not read. Ashurbanipal could read, and he could read in several languages, and he had a passion for old texts, texts older than his own civilization, texts in languages that were already dead in his own time. He sent scribes to every corner of his empire with a single instruction: find the old tablets, copy them, bring them back. When Layard dug into the ruins of Nineveh, he found Ashurbanipal's library. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, stacked in collapsed rooms, half melted by the fires that had destroyed the palace when Nineveh fell to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians in 612 BCE. The fires that had destroyed the palace had also, in a strange and beautiful irony, preserved the tablets. Clay, when it is fired, becomes ceramic. Ceramic does not rot. Ceramic does not burn twice. Ceramic does not dissolve in water. The very destruction of the library was the thing that allowed the library to survive. Over the following decades, the tablets that Layard and his successors pulled from Nineveh, and from other Mesopotamian sites like Nippur and Ur and Sippar, would slowly, painfully be deciphered by a small group of scholars working in London and Paris and Berlin. The work was agonizing. The languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, had been dead for more than 2,000 years. There were no living speakers, no dictionaries, no grammar books. The decipherers had to reconstruct the languages from scratch, working from bilingual inscriptions, from context, from sheer cognitive force. What they found, when they finally began to read, was not what anyone had expected. They had assumed that the tablets would contain administrative records, tax receipts, inventories of grain, lists of soldiers, and many of them did. But mixed in with the receipts and the inventories were other things, older things, stranger things. There were creation stories that predated the Book of Genesis by more than 1,000 years and contained, in places, language so similar to Genesis that the parallels could not be brushed aside. There were flood stories, in which a single man was warned by a god to build a great boat and save his family and the animals from a deluge that would destroy the world. There were lists of kings who had ruled, the tablets said, before the flood, kings who had reigned for spans of time so vast that no modern reader could quite take them at face value. 28,000 years, 36,000 years, numbers that broke the framework of recorded history and replaced it with something else. And there were the tablets that described the Anunnaki, The word Anunnaki is, by itself, a small puzzle. It is built from Sumerian elements that scholars have been debating for more than 100 years. The first part, Anu, sometimes written An, is the Sumerian word for the sky, and also the name of the sky god, the highest deity in the early Sumerian pantheon. The second part is harder. Most academic readings now translate the whole word as something like the offspring of An or the princely seed of An. That is, the divine descendants of the sky god. There is also an older and looser translation, popularized in the second half of the 20th century by the writer Zecharia Sitchin, and inherited by a great deal of later speculation that renders the name as those who from heaven came to earth. This looser reading is not the consensus among Assyriologists, but it has become so widespread in popular literature that it is worth naming. What we can say with confidence is that the Anunnaki, in their earliest attestations, are beings whose origin is associated with the sky, and whose presence is felt on the earth. The Sumerian tablets describe these beings in language that is, by ancient standards, oddly practical. The Anunnaki are not abstract forces. They are not nature personified. They are not vague spirits hovering at the edge of perception. They are characters. They have names. They have personalities. They have conflicts with one another. They make decisions. They argue. They build cities. They organize labor. They establish hierarchies. They have a leader. Sometimes Anu himself. Sometimes the storm god Enlil. Sometimes the wisdom god Enki. And the leadership shifts over time, the way leadership shifts in any long-running organization. And that is perhaps the strangest thing of all about the Sumerian texts. They do not read like myth, in the way modern people use that word. They read like records. They read like the careful, slightly bureaucratic accounts of a civilization that genuinely believed it was writing down its own history. Now turn to the case on your right, the fragment of papyrus, the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is, depending on how you count, either the most important religious text most people have never heard of, or one of the most important religious texts in the entire Western tradition that you simply weren't told about in school. It exists in three main versions. Scholars call them First Enoch, Second Enoch, and Third Enoch. But when people talk about the Book of Enoch, they almost always mean First Enoch, the longest and oldest of the three. First Enoch is itself a composite work, stitched together from at least 5 separate documents that were composed at different times, between roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. The oldest portion of it, the portion that matters most for our purposes tonight, is called the Book of the Watchers. It may date to as early as the 3rd century BCE, which would make it one of the oldest pieces of Jewish religious writing outside the Hebrew Bible itself. The book is written in the voice of Enoch, the patriarch mentioned briefly in the 5th chapter of Genesis, the great-grandfather of Noah, the man of whom the Bible says, in one of its strangest and most compressed sentences, that he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch does not die in the Genesis account. He simply ceases to be present. The text leaves a small mysterious gap where his ending should be, and the Book of Enoch, as it has come down to us, is essentially an attempt to fill that gap. It is the story of what Enoch saw, what he was shown, and what he was told to write down before he was taken away. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. For several centuries, the Book of Enoch was widely read in Jewish and early Christian communities. It is quoted in the New Testament, directly, by name in the small letter of Jude, which preserves a passage from 1st Enoch as if it were authoritative scripture. The passage Jude quotes lines up almost word for word with 1st Enoch chapter 1 verse 9, and we can check this, because a portion of that exact chapter has survived in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in a fragment that scholars number 4Q204. Early Christian writers, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, the author of the Letter of Barnabas, treat the book with respect. Barnabas, writing in the early 2nd century, cites it as scripture, introducing one of his quotations with the phrase, "for it is written." This was not a fringe text. It was woven into the religious imagination of the first few centuries of the Common Era in ways that are difficult to overstate. And then, slowly, it begins to fall out of favour. The process was not a single dramatic event. It was more like erosion. Different centres of the early church came to different conclusions about which books belonged in the canon and which did not. And the Book of Enoch, perhaps because it was never part of the Jewish Bible, perhaps because its claims about angels and divine politics were beginning to sit uncomfortably beside the developing theology of the institutional church, was one of the books that drifted toward the margins. By the time of the Council of Laodicea in the late 4th century, around 363 or 364 of the Common Era, the mainstream churches had mostly stopped reading it. By the 5th century it was effectively gone from the Western Christian world. It had never been formally in a fixed canon that was then ceremoniously edited to remove it. It had simply not been kept, and not being kept in an age before printing was almost the same as being erased. There was, however, one place far from the centres of European Christianity where the book had never been let go of. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, founded in the 4th century, deeply rooted in a religious culture that long predates the doctrinal disputes of medieval Europe, had preserved the entire Book of Enoch in its scriptural canon in the ancient Ethiopian language of Ge'ez. They had been reading it, copying it, treating it as sacred scripture the entire time. They simply hadn't told anyone in Europe, because no one in Europe had asked. In 1773, a Scottish traveller named James Bruce made his way to Ethiopia in search of the source of the Nile. He found what he believed to be the source, and on his way back to Europe, he carried with him 3 complete manuscripts of the Ethiopian Book of Enoch. When he returned to Britain, the manuscripts caused a quiet sensation among the small group of scholars who understood what they were looking at. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, the Western Christian world had access to a text that most of Europe had forgotten was even possible. And then, in 1947, in that cave near the Dead Sea, the shepherd threw his stone, and the pottery broke and the scrolls came out. Over the following years, as more caves were opened and more fragments were catalogued, scholars realised that portions of 1st Enoch had been preserved in Aramaic at Qumran. Not just small pieces, but fragments of almost every major section of the book except one. The scholar Joseph Milik, working at the École Biblique in Jerusalem, eventually identified and catalogued them. Cave 4 alone produced fragments of at least 11 separate Aramaic Enoch manuscripts, numbered 4 Q201 through 4 Q212. Some of the oldest of these fragments date to around 200 BCE, which means they were written within a generation or two of the composition of the Book of the Watchers itself. The fragments confirmed what scholars had begun to suspect. The book was old. It was in circulation in Jewish communities centuries before the time of Jesus. It had been read, copied, and treated as important by the same people who were reading and copying the books that would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. In the Qumran community, copies of 1st Enoch were actually more numerous than copies of many books that did make it into the canon. The book, in other words, had not always been a minor text. It had been, for a real and extended period, central, read alongside Genesis and Exodus as part of the shared imagination of a people. Its gradual sidelining was not because anyone had proved it wrong. It was because the shape of acceptable religion had slowly changed around it and it no longer fit. There is a question buried in that sidelining. The question is what the book contained that made it no longer fit. And as you stand there, in the quiet museum room, with the clay tablet on your left and the papyrus fragment on your right, you are about to find out. Of all the parallels between the Book of Enoch and the Sumerian tablets, none is stranger or more specific than the descent itself. Both traditions begin in the same place. They begin with the moment when something that did not belong on the earth came down to the earth anyway. Let's read the Sumerian version first because it is older. According to a complex of text that includes the Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish, and several smaller tablets recovered from the libraries of Nippur and Ur, the Anunnaki did not always live on the earth. They came from somewhere else. The somewhere else is described in the Sumerian texts in language that is partly geographical and partly cosmological. They came from the heavens, from Anu, the sky, but the heavens, in Sumerian thought, are not exactly the same as the modern idea of outer space. They are a place, a real place, with rooms and gates and gardens and rivers. The texts describe it the way you would describe a foreign country you had once visited and never quite forgotten. The first wave of Anunnaki arrived on the earth, the tablets say, with a specific purpose. They had come to work. The Atrahasis epic is remarkably specific about what the work involved. It involved digging. The opening lines of the tablet describe the gods digging out watercourses, clearing channels, hollowing out the beds of the Tigris and the Euphrates themselves, the 2 great rivers that would, in time, make Mesopotamian civilization possible. The work, in the literal text, is hydraulic engineering on a scale that would not be attempted by humans for thousands of years afterward. It is the shaping of the land for habitation. The popular modern interpretation, associated with the writer Zecharia Sitchin and inherited by a great deal of later speculation, holds that the deeper purpose of all this labour was the extraction of gold. The actual surviving text does not say this in so many words. It says the gods dug, and that the digging was hard, and that there was an enormous amount of it. The Sumerian sources name Enki as the figure most closely associated with the founding of Eridu. Enki, whose name in Sumerian means something like Lord of the Earth, is one of the most fascinating figures in all of Mesopotamian literature. He is a god, but he is also, in many ways, a kind of engineer. He is associated with fresh water, not with the sea, but with the rivers and the marshes and the underground aquifers that made life in southern Iraq possible at all. He is the god of crafts, of cunning, of solutions to impossible problems. He is the god you went to when you needed something built that had never been built before. The number of Anunnaki who came down with him in the earliest descent is not fixed in any single canonical text. Different tablets give different counts. The enigma Elish eventually settles on a tradition of 300 Anunnaki of the heavens and 300 of the earth. Other passages reference 50 as a sacred number associated with Enlil. The popular speculative literature has tended to harmonise all of this into a tidy figure, but the texts themselves are messier and less specific. What they do agree on is that there was a first wave, that it was led by Enki, and that it was associated with Eridu. Modern archaeologists have actually excavated Eridu. It is one of the oldest known continuously inhabited sites in the world. The lowest levels of the city date to around 5400 BCE, and the Sumerians themselves remembered Eridu as the first city, the place where civilization began, the place where the first king reigned after the gods had handed kingship down from heaven. Read that sentence again, slowly, because it is doing something quietly remarkable. The Sumerians believed that civilization began at Eridu. They also believed that kingship, the institution of organized political authority, had been handed down from heaven. Not invented, not developed, handed down from above. This is the language the tablets use. It is not metaphorical language. The Sumerian scribes were perfectly capable of writing metaphorically when they wanted to. They wrote love poems and laments and clever bureaucratic jokes that make modern translators laugh out loud. When they wanted to be metaphorical, they were. When they wrote about the descent of the Anunnaki and the founding of the first city, they were not being metaphorical. They were writing in their plainest, most matter-of-fact register. They were writing the way you would write a memo. The Atrahasis epic tells us that, at first, the work was done by a particular subset of the divine company. The text divides the gods into two groups. The senior gods are called the Anunnaki. The junior gods, the ones who actually carried the loads and dug the channels, are called the Igigi. The Igigi laboured in the earth. They dug, they hauled, and after some time they grew tired of it. They held a council in the night. They burned their tools as a signal of revolt, and then they marched together and surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the senior god in charge of the operation, and they demanded relief. And here is where the Sumerian story takes the turn that has fascinated and disturbed readers ever since. To solve the labour problem, Enki proposed a solution. He would create a new kind of being, a being shaped like the Anunnaki, but smaller, weaker, mortal, to do the work that the Anunnaki no longer wanted to do. He would create this new being from the clay of the earth, mixed with the blood of one of the lesser gods. The new being would be intelligent enough to follow instructions and skilled enough to do the work, but not so intelligent or so strong that it could threaten the order of things. The new being was called Lulu. The name is sometimes translated as primitive worker. It is the Sumerian word in the oldest written tradition we have for what we would call a human. You don't have to believe this. Tonight isn't about belief. Tonight is about reading the texts in their own voices and noticing what they say. What the Sumerian texts say is that humanity was created, designed, almost, for a specific purpose, by beings who had come from somewhere else, in order to solve a labour problem that those beings had encountered after their arrival on the earth. The texts say this clearly. They say it more than once. They say it in multiple separate sources that come from different cities and different centuries. It is one of the most consistent themes in all of Sumerian religious literature. And then, several thousand years later, on the other side of the ancient Near East, in a completely different language, with a completely different theology, another group of writers picked up the thread of the same story. Open the Book of Enoch to chapter 6, the Book of the Watchers, the opening of the story. The text begins by quoting the strange compressed passage from Genesis chapter 6, the passage about the sons of God who looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful and took wives from among them. In the Hebrew Bible, this passage is only 4 verses long. It is one of the strangest and most abrupt passages in the entire Old Testament. It seems to be the broken edge of a much longer story, a story that the editors of Genesis have deliberately compressed, perhaps because they were uncomfortable with what the longer version contained. The Book of Enoch gives us the longer version. According to 1 Enoch chapter 6, the sons of God who descended in the days of Jared, Jared being the father of Enoch, the great-great-grandfather of Noah, were not vague spiritual presences. They were beings. They had a leader. His name was Semyazar, sometimes written Shemihazar. They had subordinates, and the subordinates had ranks, and the ranks were precise. There were 200 of them in total, 20 leaders, each with 10 followers, a military structure. They descended, the text says, in the days of Jared, on the summit of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real mountain. You can find it on a map. It sits on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, the southernmost peak of the anti-Lebanon range, rising to about 9,200 feet above the surrounding terrain. Snow lies on its summit for most of the year. From the top, on a clear day, you can see across a vast stretch of the Levant, across the Bekaa Valley, across the Galilee, across the upper reaches of the Jordan. It is the kind of place that, in the ancient world, would have been considered sacred almost by default. Mountains were always sacred. Snow was always sacred. Visibility, the ability to see from one place all of the world that mattered, was always sacred. The Book of Enoch tells us that the 200 named the mountain. They called it Hermon, and the text plays on a Semitic root, kerem, which in Hebrew and Aramaic can mean set apart, devoted, or, in its starkest sense, placed under a binding oath. The Book of Enoch seems to be doing a deliberate piece of wordplay here. It is suggesting that the mountain was called the set-apart place because of what was sworn there, and what was sworn there could not be unsworn. Modern Semitic linguists are more cautious than the Book of Enoch about what the name actually means in its original form. The root may simply mean sacred, without the darker overtones. But the Enochic reading is embedded in the text itself, and it is doing important work. The oath, according to the Book of Enoch, was the oath of the descent itself. The 200 watchers, watchers being a translation of the Aramaic Syrian, a word that suggests beings whose function is to observe, to keep vigil, to remain awake while others sleep, had been forbidden, by some higher authority, from doing what they were now about to do. They knew it was forbidden. They knew there would be consequences, and before they took the final step of descending fully into the human world, they swore to one another that they would all share in the consequences together. The oath was a kind of mutual hostage-taking. None of them could betray the others. None of them could turn back. They were bound by their own words to see the thing through. Then they descended. Now hold the two stories side by side for a moment. The Sumerian texts say that the Anunnaki, led by Enki, descended to the earth on what reads as an official mission, sanctioned from above with the approval of the highest authority of their order. The Book of Enoch says that 200 watchers, led by Semyazar, descended to the earth on an unauthorized mission, in defiance of their superiors, bound to one another by a forbidden oath. These are not the same descent. They cannot be the same descent. The numbers are different, the leaders are different, the authorization is different. But notice what they share. Both descents are physical. Both involve a specific number of beings, not a vague crowd, but a counted, named group. Both involve a leadership structure. Both are deliberate acts planned in advance, undertaken with full knowledge of the stakes. Both arrive at a specific geographical location on the Earth, and that location, in both cases, is remembered for centuries afterward as the place where it happened. And both are followed, almost immediately, by the same sequence of events: knowledge transfer, reproduction with humans, punishment from above, a flood, a survivor. It is possible to read this and conclude that the Sumerian and the Enochic accounts are simply two versions of the same older story, that the Book of Enoch is recycling Mesopotamian material, dressing it in new theological clothes. That is the standard scholarly explanation, and we will return to it later with the seriousness it deserves. But there is another reading, a quieter reading, a reading that the texts themselves seem almost to invite if you let them. What if the two accounts are not the same descent at all, but two descents separated by time? The Anunnaki of the Sumerian tradition as the first wave, the official sanctioned group operating within the bounds of whatever authority structure they answered to, and the 200 Watchers of the Book of Enoch as a later wave, a faction, a breakaway group, a rebellion within the same larger order, who came down without permission to do something that the first group had been forbidden from doing. This would not be a contradiction between the texts, it would be a sequence. The Sumerian tablets would be preserving the official version, the version told from the perspective of the established order. The Book of Enoch would be preserving the rebel version, the version told from the perspective of the higher authority that the rebels had defied. Two sides of the same story, two angles on the same event. 200 beings descended onto a mountain that they themselves named the set-apart place. 50 or more beings, led by Enki, descended into the marshlands and built the first city on Earth. In both cases, the world was never the same again. If the descent is the strangest parallel between the two traditions, the second strangest is what happened after. Because in both the Sumerian tablets and the Book of Enoch, the beings who descended did not simply arrive and live among humans as silent observers. They taught. They taught specific things in specific subjects with specific results. And the things they taught in both traditions are almost identical. Let's begin with the Book of Enoch, because the list it gives us is unusually precise. First Enoch chapter 8 is one of the most peculiar chapters in any ancient religious text. It reads, in places, less like scripture and more like a faculty roster at a strange and slightly menacing university. The text gives us names, the names of specific watchers, and assigns each one a specific area of instruction. The first name is Azazel. Azazel is the watcher who taught the working of metals. He showed humanity how to extract iron and copper from the earth, how to smelt them, how to forge them into weapons, swords, knives, daggers, breastplates, shields. He taught the making of arms. And then, in the same passage, almost as a kind of dark coda, he is also said to have taught the women, taught them how to use cosmetics, how to dye their eyelids, how to wear precious stones, how to adorn themselves in ways that the text considers dangerous. The juxtaposition is strange and deliberate. Weapons for the men, ornaments for the women. Two sides of the same forbidden gift. The gift of artificial transformation, the ability to make yourself or the world around you look and behave in ways that nature alone would not have allowed. The second name is Semyaza himself, the leader. The text is less specific about what he taught directly, but the implication is that he taught the general arts of incantation, the speaking of binding words, the use of language to compel things that should not be compellable. Then comes Amaros, who taught the resolving of incantations, which is to say, he taught the counter-magic, the art of undoing what other watchers had bound. Already in the curriculum itself you can see a kind of internal arms race. One being teaches a binding, another teaches the unbinding of it. The technology spirals. Barakel, sometimes written Barakel, taught the reading of the lightning. Whether this means literal meteorology or something more like divination by celestial flashes, the text is not entirely clear. Kokabel taught the reading of the stars. Not astronomy in the modern sense. Astronomy as a mathematical science came later. But the older art that we would now call astrology. The mapping of celestial patterns onto human destinies. Tamiel taught astronomy in its more technical sense. The actual measurement of the heavens. Sariel taught the courses of the moon. The lunar calendar. The marking of months and the prediction of the moon's phases. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Aratiel taught the signs of the earth. Geomancy, the reading of the land itself for omens. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. There are more names in the longer manuscripts. The lists vary slightly between the Ethiopian, Greek and Aramaic versions, but the curriculum is consistent across all of them. Metalworking, weapons, cosmetics and adornment, astrology, astronomy, calendrical science, meteorology, geomancy, the reading of celestial signs. Now stop and notice what is happening in this list. These are not random subjects. These are not the arbitrary specialties of a few scattered teachers. These are, taken together, almost exactly the foundational technologies of early civilization. Metallurgy is what allows you to move from the Stone Age into the Bronze Age, and from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. Astronomy and the lunar calendar are what allow you to develop agriculture on a large scale, because you need to know when to plant and when to harvest. geomancy, and the reading of earth signs are the precursor of mineral prospecting and land surveying. The reading of the sky is the precursor of navigation. Cosmetics and ornamentation are the beginning of trade in luxury goods, which is the beginning of long-distance commerce. The Book of Enoch is, in effect, listing the entire technological foundation of human civilization and saying, humans did not invent any of this. It was given to them by specific beings, with specific names, whose names the text remembers. And here is the thing that has bothered scholars and readers for centuries, the thing that is genuinely difficult to explain away. Every single one of the subjects on the Enochic list shows up in the archaeological record at roughly the same moment in human history. Metallurgy emerges, astronomy emerges, calendar systems emerge, weapons technology emerges, long-distance trade in luxury goods emerges. They all emerge in the same general region, the Fertile Crescent, and within the same general window of time, between roughly 6000 BCE and 3000 BCE. The window is, by archaeological standards, narrow. By the standards of the previous tens of thousands of years of human existence, during which technology had moved at a glacial pace, the window is so narrow that it looks, from a certain angle, almost like an event, as if someone had thrown a switch. Modern archaeology has its explanations for this: the agricultural revolution, the rise of sedentary populations, the conditions of the post-glacial climate, the accumulation of population density past some critical threshold. These are real explanations. They are probably part of the truth, but they do not by themselves explain why so many independent technologies arrived in such a tight cluster, in such a small region, after hundreds of thousands of years of relative stasis. The Book of Enoch offers a different explanation. The Book of Enoch says that the technologies arrived together because they were brought together by beings who knew them already and who decided, for reasons of their own, in defiance of an authority that had told them not to teach them to a species that was not yet ready. Now let's look at the Sumerian version of the same idea, and let's go deeper into it than most modern retellings do. Because the Sumerian tradition gives us something the Book of Enoch gives us: a list of names. In the Sumerian and later Babylonian traditions, the bringers of knowledge to humanity were called the Apkallu. The word is sometimes translated as sages, and sometimes as wise ones, but neither translation quite captures the strangeness of what the texts describe. The Apkallu were not human teachers. They were not even gods in the full sense. They were a kind of intermediate being, half divine, half something else, created by Enki in the deep fresh waters of the Abzu, the underground sea, and sent up into the human world with a mandate that one cuneiform text puts in striking language: to ensure the correct execution of the plans of heaven and earth. There were 7 of them in the standard tradition, 7 Apkallu, each associated with one of the 7 antediluvian kings, the kings who had reigned before the flood. Our most important source for the names of the 7 is a Neo-Assyrian ritual series called Bet Meseri, which translates to something like the protected house. The text is an incantation series designed to guard a dwelling against evil, and its 3rd tablet contains the oldest surviving full catalogue of the 7 Apkallu. The series was identified and published in the 20th century by the German Assyriologist Raquel Borger, and the names it preserves are these: Uana, the first, who is sometimes said to have finished the plans for heaven and earth. This is the being whom a later Babylonian priest writing in Greek would call Owans. Uanaduga, the second, endowed with comprehensive intelligence. Enmeduga, the third, the one allotted a good fate. Enmegalama, the fourth, who was born in a house. Enmebeluga, the fifth, who grew up on pasture land. And Enlilda, the sixth, the conjurer of the city of Eridu, always Eridu, the first city in every version of the story. And Utuabzu, the seventh, of whom the text says something remarkable. It says that Utuabzu ascended into heaven. Pause on that for a moment, because it deserves attention. The 7th and last of the antediluvian Apkallu, in the oldest Sumerian and Babylonian ritual tradition we have, ends his time on the earth by being taken up into the sky. And in the Hebrew tradition that would eventually produce the Book of Enoch, the 7th patriarch from Adam, a man named Enoch, walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. 7th and taken, 7th and taken. It is exactly the kind of parallel that has led the Norwegian scholar Helge Kvanvig, one of the foremost specialists on the Enochic literature, to argue in his massive book Primeval History, Babylonian, Biblical and Enochic, published by Brill in 2011, that the figure of Enoch is patterned directly on Enmeduranki and Utuabzu, that the Hebrew patriarch who ascended was, in some deep way, a Jewish remembering of a Mesopotamian figure who had already been preserved in cuneiform for more than 1,000 years. There is a second important source for the names, and it is even more curious. In 1959 and 1960, during excavations at the Seleucid-era temple of the god Anu in Uruk, a small cuneiform tablet turned up in a place called the Bit Resh. The tablet has been given the catalogue number W200307. Scholars call it the Uruk list of kings and sages. It dates to 165 or 164 BCE, almost exactly the same window in which the later portions of First Enoch were being composed, and what it does is pair each of the 7 antediluvian kings with the specific Apkallu who advised him. During the reign of Ayalu the king, Adapa was the sage. During the reign of Alalga the king, Uanduga was the sage. During the reign of Ameluana the king, Enmeduga was the sage. On it goes, through all 7 reigns, and the last pairing is the one that matters most for us tonight. During the reign of Enmeduranki, the king Utuabzu was the sage. Enmeduranki himself is the king, whom later scholars like Kvanvig have identified as the Mesopotamian prototype for Enoch, a king of the city of Sippar, associated with the sun god Shamash, who according to the Mesopotamian tradition was taken up into the presence of the gods and shown the secrets of heaven and earth. He was taught divination. He was shown how to read omens in the oil on water and the entrails of animals. He was given tablets, and then he was sent back down to teach what he had learned to the first human specialists in divination. Stop and notice what is happening here. Enmeduranki is a king who is taken up to heaven, shown the secrets, and brought back. Enoch is a patriarch who walks with God and is taken. Enmeduranki is advised by an Apkallu named Utuabzu, a sage who himself ascends into heaven. Enoch is a man who himself ascends into heaven. The parallels are not loose. They are mirror-like, and the curriculum that the Apkallu bring is, step for step, the curriculum that the Watchers bring. Our Hellenistic-era summary of all of this comes from a Babylonian priest named Berossus, who lived in the 3rd century BCE and wrote a history of his civilization in Greek. For the benefit of the new Greek-speaking masters of the world after Alexander, Berossus's original book, the Babyloniaca, is lost. We know it only through quotations preserved in later writers like Alexander Polyhista, Eusebius of Caesarea, and Flavius Josephus. But the quotations that survive are vivid and specific. According to Berossus, Oannes, that is Uana, the first of the Apkallu, emerged from the waters of the Erythraean Sea, which the ancients used to refer to the Persian Gulf and its adjacent waters, during the reign of the very first king in the very first city. Oannes, Berossus tells us, had the body of a fish, or rather, he had a fish-like form covering a human form. The descriptions vary. Above the waist, he was clearly humanoid. Below the waist, or wrapped around him like a cloak, was the form of a great fish. His face was a human face, but it emerged from beneath the head of the fish, like a man wearing a strange and elaborate ceremonial garment. Oannes came out of the water at dawn. He spent the day among the people of Eridu. He taught them. He taught them the art of writing. He taught them the construction of cities. He taught them the building of temples. He taught them the measurement of land. He taught them the principles of law. He taught them mathematics. He taught them agriculture. And at sunset he returned to the water. He did not eat human food. He did not sleep on land. He gave the day to teaching and the night to wherever it was he had come from. After Oannes, 6 more Apkallu followed, each one associated with the reign of a different antediluvian king. And then, Berossus tells us, the flood came. After the flood, the direct presence of the Apkallu on the earth came to an end. As he famously put it, in a phrase that later Greek writers preserved, from that time, nothing further has been discovered. Nothing further. The implication is that everything that matters, everything that underwrites civilization, was given in the window between the descent of Oannes and the coming of the flood, and that after the flood human knowledge has been, at best, the careful preservation of that inheritance. Read the 2 lists side by side, and notice what they have in common. The Watchers taught metallurgy, the Apkallu taught the working of materials, the Watchers taught astronomy and the lunar calendar, the Apkallu taught the measurement of time, the Watchers taught the reading of celestial and earthly signs, the Apkallu taught divination and the interpretation of omens, the Watchers taught the making of weapons, the Apkallu taught the establishment of cities, and the laws by which cities are governed. And in the ancient world, you could not have one without the other. The Watchers taught the dyeing of fabrics and the use of cosmetics. The Apkallu taught the crafts and the arts. The lists are not identical in their wording. They could not be, because they were composed in different languages, in different theological frameworks, by writers who were almost certainly unaware of each other's existence in any direct sense. But the lists cover the same territory. They name the same set of human technologies. They locate those technologies in the same window of human prehistory, and they attribute those technologies to the same kind of source. Beings from elsewhere, beings whose presence on the earth was temporary, beings who taught humans things that humans, on their own, would not have known. The Sumerian tradition does not, on the whole, say that the Apkallu were forbidden from doing what they did. They are mostly benevolent figures, agents of the highest divine authority, executing the will of the great gods by educating the human species. The Book of Enoch, by contrast, says that the Watchers were absolutely forbidden, that their teaching was a crime, that it brought corruption into the world, and that they were punished for it. This is a real difference between the two traditions, and it should not be minimized. But it is also, when you sit with it long enough, exactly the kind of difference you would expect if the two traditions were preserving two perspectives on the same set of events. The Sumerian version is the official version, told from the standpoint of the order that authorized the teaching. The Enochic version is the dissenting version, told from the standpoint of an authority that did not authorize it. In the Sumerian texts, the bringers of knowledge are heroes. In the Book of Enoch, they are criminals. In both texts, they are the same kind of beings, doing the same kind of work, transmitting the same kind of curriculum. When two traditions agree on the concrete details and disagree on the moral, what they are usually preserving is not two independent inventions. What they are usually preserving is a memory that has been interpreted from two different angles. Before we go further, we need to stop at a text that most people have never heard of. Because when we talk about the relationship between the Sumerian tradition and the Book of Enoch, there is one document that does not get mentioned often enough in popular retellings, and when you do mention it, the conversation changes. It is perhaps the most direct textual bridge between the two worlds that has ever surfaced. It was found in the same caves as the fragments of First Enoch, and it does something that makes even cautious scholars pause. The text is called the Book of Giants. For most of the 20th century, the Book of Giants was known only by name. Medieval Jewish writers mentioned it. Early Christian heresiologists condemned it. A 3rd century Persian religious teacher named Mani, the founder of the Manichaean religion, which at its peak stretched from the Mediterranean to western China, had taken up the Book of Giants as one of the core scriptures of his new faith. Fragments of his version, written in Middle Persian and Sogdian and Uyghur and even medieval Chinese, had been turning up throughout the 20th century in the ruins of monasteries along the old Silk Road. Scholars knew that Mani's Book of Giants must have been based on something older, but until the Dead Sea Scrolls no one could say what. Then, in the caves above the Dead Sea, the Aramaic originals began to emerge. They were in fragments. That is always how these things emerge, in fragments, but the fragments came from multiple caves, numbered in the formal catalogue as 1Q23, 1Q24, 2Q26, 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q531, 4Q532, 4Q556, and 6Q8. The work of identifying them took decades. The initial identifications were made by Josef Milik in the 1970s. The definitive modern edition and study was published by the British scholar Lauren Stukenbrook in 1997, in a volume titled The Book of Giants from Qumran, issued by Mohr Siebeck in Tübingen as part of a distinguished series on ancient Judaism. The oldest of the Qumran manuscripts of the Book of Giants, 4Q530, has been paleographically dated to approximately 100 BCE. The composition itself is older. Some scholars place it in the late 3rd or early 2nd century BCE, contemporary with or even slightly earlier than the Book of the Watchers. And at Qumran, the Book of Giants was popular. The scholar George Nicholsberg, in his standard commentary on First Enoch, notes that the Book of Giants was, by the measure of surviving copies, one of the most frequently copied Enochic texts at Qumran, arguably more popular than some of the sections of First Enoch itself. The community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls considered it important. They made copies, they read it, they did not let it go. What is the Book of Giants about? It is about what the Watchers left behind. The book takes the raw framework of the descent story from the Book of the Watchers, the 200 beings, the oath on Mount Hermon, the forbidden teaching, the hybrid offspring, and it does something the Book of the Watchers does not do. It zooms in. It puts the camera on the ground at the level of the giants themselves. It gives them names. It lets them talk to each other. It shows them having dreams. It shows them arguing about what the dreams mean. It shows them sending messengers to the patriarch Enoch, who is living somewhere far away, to ask him to interpret what they have seen. Two of the giants named in the Qumran fragments are called Oya and Hahya. They are brothers, and they are described as the sons of Semyaza himself, the same Semyaza who leads the descent in the Book of the Watchers. A third giant is named Mahaweh, and in one remarkable passage preserved in the fragmentary 4Q530, Mahaweh is described as flying on his own across the desert, over a place called the Great Desolation, to reach Enoch and deliver a message from the giants. The image of a giant in flight crossing the earth like wind is the kind of detail that stays in the mind long after the reading is done. The giants are having dreams. The dreams are dreams of judgment. In one of them, preserved in 4Q530 column 2, lines 16 through 20, a great throne is set up in heaven, and one whose hair is like pure wool takes his seat upon it, and the courts of heaven convene, and a judgment is delivered. The passage is almost word for word the same as a passage in the biblical book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. Scholars have written whole essays on the relationship between these two throne visions. Some argue that Daniel is borrowing from the Book of Giants. Others argue that both are drawing on an older shared tradition. No one thinks the agreement is a coincidence, but the detail that matters most for our story tonight, the detail that makes the Book of Giants the textual bridge it is this. Among the names of the giants listed in the Qumran fragments is one that stops you cold when you read it. Gilgamesh. Yes, that Gilgamesh. The hero of the oldest surviving long narrative poem in human history, the king of Uruk, the 2/3 god, 1/3 human ruler whose epic, written in Akkadian and preserved on 12 clay tablets, was among the texts found in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. The Gilgamesh who travels to find the survivor of the flood and to ask him the secret of eternal life. That Gilgamesh. In the Aramaic fragments of the Book of Giants, he appears as one of the giants, a Nephilim, an offspring of a watcher and a human woman. The name is preserved in the Aramaic script, transliterated as Gilgmes, and it appears alongside the name of Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest whom Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill in the most famous sequence of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Humbaba too is a giant in the Book of Giants. Humbaba too is counted among the children of the Watchers. Think for a moment about what this means. A Jewish text written in Aramaic, probably composed in the 3rd or early 2nd century BCE, preserved in a cave by the Dead Sea for more than 2,000 years, considered sacred enough by its community to be copied and recopied and buried for safekeeping. This text explicitly and by name identifies the hero of the oldest Mesopotamian epic as one of the offspring of the fallen angels of Genesis chapter 6. The Jewish author of the Book of Giants knew who Gilgamesh was. He knew the Epic of Gilgamesh, or at least knew the tradition it belonged to, and he folded Gilgamesh into the story of the Watchers as if the folding were the most natural thing in the world. This is not a silent parallel. This is not two traditions saying similar things in different languages and leaving the reader to notice the similarity. This is a Jewish text from the time of the Second Temple, reaching across the linguistic and theological boundary to the Mesopotamian tradition, picking up one of its most famous figures and placing him directly inside the Enochic framework. The border between the two traditions in the Book of Giants is not a wall. It is a door, and someone has walked through it. Scholars read this in different ways. The most cautious reading, and perhaps the most common, is that the author of the Book of Giants was a Jewish writer who had grown up in a world saturated with Mesopotamian literature, who knew Gilgamesh the way a modern educated person might know Achilles or Odysseus, and who incorporated the figure into his own story as a kind of literary reference. In this reading, the Book of Giants is evidence of cultural contact, not of shared memory. The Jewish writers are drawing on Babylonian material because they lived in a world where Babylonian material was everywhere. That is the cautious reading. But there is another reading, and the Book of Giants itself seems to invite it. Because in the Book of Giants, Gilgamesh is not a literary reference. He is a character. In 4Q530, Another giant named Oya speaks to Gilgamesh about a terrible dream he's had. The dream is about the coming destruction of the giants. Oya tells Gilgamesh what he has seen, and the two of them share the unease of beings who know their time is running out. This is not a footnote. This is Gilgamesh brought into the inner life of the Enochic narrative as if he belonged there from the beginning. Why would a Jewish writer in the 3rd century BCE do this? Why would he take the Mesopotamian hero, a figure from an older religious tradition that his own tradition had every reason to distance itself from, and put him inside a text about the sins of the Watchers and the coming judgment of God? One answer is that the Jewish writer believed the Mesopotamian material was, at some deep level, true. Not literarily useful, true. He believed that Gilgamesh had been a real being, a real giant, a real son of the Watchers, and that the story about him preserved in the Mesopotamian tradition was a partial remembering of a history that the Jewish tradition was also remembering from a different angle with a different theological frame. In this reading, the Book of Giants is doing exactly what an honest historian would do when confronted with two independent sources about the same event. It is cross-referencing. It is saying, here is what we remember, and here is what they remember, and the two memories are about the same things. There is no way to prove which reading is correct. The text is fragmentary. Whole columns are missing. We do not know what the full version of the Book of Giants said about Gilgamesh, or about Humbaba, or about the relationship between the Mesopotamian and the Jewish strands of the tradition. What we have is enough to notice the bridge, and not enough to walk fully across it. But the bridge is there. It has been there since at least the late 3rd century BCE, lying in a cave by the Dead Sea until a shepherd's stone broke the jar that held it. And the fact that it is there changes what we are allowed to say about the parallels between the two traditions. It is no longer quite possible to say that the Sumerian and the Enochic accounts are unrelated traditions that happen to resemble each other. They are related traditions. The relationship is textually visible. A Jewish writer in Aramaic named a Sumerian hero as one of the Nephilim of Genesis, and the community that preserved the scroll thought it important enough to copy at least 9 separate times. That is the kind of thing that deserves a moment of silence. We have talked about what the beings did. We have not yet talked about what they looked like. And here too the parallels between the two traditions are difficult to dismiss. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers in language that is unmistakably physical. They are not spirits. They are not abstractions. They are bodies. Strange bodies. Beautiful bodies. Frightening bodies. But bodies all the same. They are tall. The text mentions their height repeatedly, and it mentions the height of their offspring even more often. The Nephilim are said to have been giants, beings of unnatural size whose bodies eventually became too large for the earth to sustain, who consumed all the food humanity could produce and then began to consume humanity itself. The picture is grim, and the text does not flinch from it. But the Watchers themselves, as adults, are not described primarily in terms of bulk. They are described in terms of light. Their faces shine like the sun. Their eyes are like burning torches. Their garments are white, or fiery, or both. When Enoch is taken into their presence, when he ascends in his vision to the place where the bound Watchers are being held, the text describes the experience as almost unbearable. The light is too much. The cold is too much. The voices speaking in languages he does not know are too much. He is, throughout the visions, on the edge of being overwhelmed. This luminosity is one of the most consistent features of the Watchers in 1st Enoch. It is also, not coincidentally, one of the most consistent features of high divine beings throughout the ancient Near Eastern literature in general. Beings of high status, whether you call them gods or angels or sons of God or Watchers, tend to give off light. Their faces tend to shine. Their eyes tend to burn. Their robes tend to gleam. The motif is so widespread that scholars sometimes treat it as a kind of stock description, but the convention itself has to come from somewhere. And it is at minimum interesting that when the Book of Enoch wants to describe a being who is decidedly not human, a being who has come from elsewhere, a being whose presence is overwhelming and dangerous, the word it reaches for again and again is light. Now look at the cylinder seals from ancient Mesopotamia. These are some of the oldest images human beings have ever made. Small carved stones, only an inch or two long, designed to be rolled across wet clay to leave an impression. They were used as personal signatures, the way we might use a stamp today. And on many of them, the gods of Sumer are depicted in remarkable detail. Enki has a very specific iconography on the seals. He's shown as a tall, bearded humanoid figure, dressed in the layered robes that mark high status in Sumerian art. And from his shoulders on either side flow two streams of water. Real water, not metaphor. Fish are sometimes shown swimming inside the streams, suggesting that the artist understood the streams as actual rivers issuing from the body of the god. Sometimes the streams meet other streams, forming the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two great rivers of Mesopotamia, the rivers without which the entire civilization could not have existed. The image is doing several things at once. It identifies Enki as the source of fresh water. It identifies him with the wisdom that flows like water. The Sumerian language uses water metaphors for knowledge constantly, in ways that survive in our own English idioms. But it is also, on a more literal level, depicting Enki as a being from whom water issues, as a being whose body is in some sense a source of the substance that makes life on Earth possible. The Apkallu themselves are depicted on the seals in a related but distinctive way. The Dutch Assyriologist Frans Vigerman, in his landmark 1992 book Mesopotamian Protective Spirits, The Ritual Texts, identified three distinct iconographic types. The first is the fish cloak type, drawn directly from the Berossus description of Oan, humanoid figures wearing the skin of a carp-like fish, the Puradu fish, draped over their heads and backs like a ritual garment. This is the form most closely associated with the pre-flood sages. The second is a fully human form, bearded and wingless, which Vigerman associated with the post-flood sages, the Umanu, the craftsmen scholars who followed the Apkallu once the direct divine presence had been withdrawn. And the third is the type most modern viewers recognise instantly, even without knowing what it is, the winged eagle-headed figure carrying a small bucket and what looks like a pine cone, performing some kind of ritual gesture over a sacred tree. These bird-headed Apkallu cover the walls of the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, built in the 9th century BCE. Anyone who has walked through the Assyrian galleries of the British Museum or the Louvre has stood in front of them, perhaps without knowing that the tradition they belong to was the same tradition as the one about the 7 sages who came out of the water to teach humanity at the beginning of the world. What the three forms have in common is hybridity. The Apkallu are always part one thing and part another. They occupy the boundary between categories that, for ordinary humans, are not supposed to be crossed. They have fish skin on human bodies, or eagle heads on human torsos, or wings where wings should not be. This hybrid quality is the visual signature of beings who do not belong entirely to the world they are operating in. They are visiting. They are temporary. They have come from somewhere where the rules are different, and the visual symbols of their bodies, the fish, the wings, the streams of water, the strange ceremonial objects, are all ways of saying that they are not from here. Compare the two iconographies. Compare the luminous tall beings with shining faces in the Book of Enoch to the tall, robed, water-bearing hybrid beings on the Sumerian seals. They are not identical. They are not even, on the surface, particularly similar. The Enochic watchers do not have streams of water flowing from their shoulders. The Sumerian Anunnaki are not generally described as luminous, but they share something deeper than the surface details. They share a certain kind of otherness. They share the visual and verbal signals of beings who are physically present in the human world but who do not entirely belong to it. In both traditions, when the writers want to make it absolutely clear that the beings they are describing are not just impressive humans, they reach for signs of impossibility. The faces too bright to look at, the bodies that contain rivers, the forms that are part fish and part man, the eyes like torches, the robes that gleam. You can call these literary conventions, and you would not be wrong to do so. But conventions develop for reasons, and the reason for this particular convention, the reason it shows up again and again across a region that contains some of the oldest cities and the oldest writing in the world, is that the people who created the conventions were trying to describe something that, in their view, did not look like an ordinary human, and did not behave like an ordinary human, and did not, as far as they could tell, come from anywhere ordinary. In both traditions, the descent and the teaching do not end well. Something goes wrong. The order of things is disturbed. A higher authority, whose presence has been hovering in the background of the story all along, finally intervenes. And the intervention, in both traditions, takes the same general shape. The Book of Enoch tells the story of the punishment in detail, and the detail is one of the things that makes the book so unsettling to read. This is not a vague divine retribution. This is not lightning from the sky. This is not the sudden disappearance of the offending beings into a metaphysical void. The punishment in the Book of Enoch is described in operational terms. It involves planning. It involves logistics. It involves named subordinates carrying out specific instructions. The story begins with humanity itself crying out. Knowledge that should have remained hidden has spread across the earth. Weapons have been forged in numbers that previous generations could not have imagined. The hybrid offspring of the Watchers, the Nephilim, have grown so large and so numerous that they have begun to consume everything in their path. The earth is suffering, the ordinary people are suffering, and the suffering rises in the language of the book like smoke. It rises until it reaches the place where the highest authority is sitting, and the highest authority finally takes notice. In the Book of Enoch, the highest authority is described in terms that are deliberately impersonal. He is the Lord of Spirits. He is the Most High. He is the Ancient of Days. The impression is of something so far above the action that direct intervention would be almost beneath it. Instead, the Most High delegates. He calls on 4 of his most trusted servants, the archangels Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, and he gives each of them a specific task. Raphael is told to deal with Azazel. The instructions are precise. Raphael is to bind Azazel hand and foot. He is to throw him into the darkness. He is to make an opening in the desert at a place called Dudael, a real place name, though its exact location is debated, and cast Azazel into it. He is to cover Azazel with rough and jagged rocks. He is to leave him there in absolute darkness with no light at all until the day of the great judgment. And on that day, the text says, Azazel will be cast into the fire. Gabriel is told to deal with the children of the Watchers, the Nephilim. He is to provoke them against one another. He is to make them turn upon each other in violent civil war so that they will destroy themselves through their own actions. The image is one of cold, bureaucratic efficiency. The Nephilim are too dangerous to fight in open battle, so they are made to fight each other. Michael is told to deal with Semyaza and the rest of the Watchers. He is to bind them in the valleys of the earth, in the deep places, the underground places, the hollows where light does not reach. He is to bind them for 70 generations until the day of judgment. And Uriel is told to deal with Noah, to warn him, to tell him what is coming, to give him the time he will need to prepare. Notice the structure of this. The Watchers are not killed, they are imprisoned, they are placed in custody. This is not the language you use for beings who have ceased to exist. This is the language you use for prisoners. You imprison something that is still there. You bind something that could otherwise still act. The Book of Enoch is telling us that the Watchers are still where Michael and Raphael put them. They are still bound. They are still waiting. And the day of judgment that the book keeps referring to is, in the framework of the text, still coming. After the binding comes the flood. And the flood in the Book of Enoch is not a natural disaster. It is a deliberate act of cosmic housekeeping, decided upon at the highest level of the divine order for a specific purpose. The purpose is to reset the human world. The corruption introduced by the Watchers, the corruption of forbidden knowledge, of mixed bloodlines, of weapons and warfare and unauthorized arts, has spread so far that no piecemeal correction can repair it. The whole experiment of post-Watcher humanity has to be ended, and a new experiment has to be started from a single righteous family. Noah and his sons and their wives, 8 people in a wooden box, riding out a deluge that wipes everything else away. The flood story exists in multiple Mesopotamian sources, each of them centuries older than the Hebrew version. In the earliest known version, recorded on a Sumerian tablet from the 3rd millennium BCE, the survivor is named Ziusudra. In the Old Babylonian Atrahasis epic, the survivor is named Atrahasis, which means exceedingly wise. In the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved on Tablet 11 of the Great Epic, one of the tablet's layered successors pulled from the ruins of Nineveh, the survivor is named Utnapishtim, which means he found life. 3 names, 3 versions, but the same story in every essential particular. A god decides that humanity has become a problem. The Atrahasis epic gives a specific reason. Humans have become too numerous, and their noise is keeping the gods from sleeping. The reason is almost comic in its specificity, but the consequences are not comic at all. The chief god, Enlil, decides that humanity must be destroyed. The lesser gods are sworn to secrecy, so that no human will be warned. But Enki, the same Enki who, in the older parts of the tradition, had first descended to the earth and created humanity, disagrees with the decision. He cannot openly defy Enlil's decree, because he is bound by oath. So he does what wisdom gods always do in stories like this. He finds a loophole. Enki goes to the dwelling of his most devoted human follower, Atrahasis in one version, Utnapishtim in another, and he speaks his warning to the wall of the dwelling. He does not, technically, speak to the human inside, he speaks to the wall, and the human, who happens to be on the other side of the wall, happens to overhear. In this way, Enki keeps his oath of secrecy in the most literal possible sense, while still ensuring that the warning gets through. The warning is detailed. The human is told exactly what is coming. He is told to build a great boat of specific dimensions with specific rooms inside. He is told to bring his family, his livestock, the seeds of the plants he will need to replant the world. He is told to seal himself inside and to wait. When the flood comes, it lasts for days. The whole earth is covered. The mountains disappear under the water. Even the gods themselves, in some versions of the story, are frightened by what they have unleashed. They retreat to the highest heaven and crouch there like dogs, weeping for the destruction they have called down. When the waters recede, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. The survivor releases birds, a dove, a swallow, a raven, to test whether the waters have gone down enough for life to resume. When the birds do not return, he knows there is land somewhere. He opens the boat, he emerges, he builds an altar, he offers a sacrifice, and the gods, the same gods who had ordered the destruction, gather around the smell of the sacrifice like flies, in one of the strangest and most disturbing similes in all of ancient literature, and they accept it. If you have ever read the flood story in Genesis, you already know almost every element of this: the boat, the dimensions, the animals, the birds released to test the waters, the mountain, the altar, the sacrifice. The Hebrew version is not a copy of the Sumerian. The theological framework is different. The names of the gods are different. The moral logic is different. But the structural debt is undeniable. There is no serious scholarly dispute about this anymore, and the Book of Enoch sits in the middle of this tradition in a revealing position. The Book of Enoch is later than the Mesopotamian flood stories, and yet it preserves elements of the flood story, particularly the connection between the flood and the watchers, that the Hebrew Bible has trimmed away. In Genesis, the flood is sent because of human wickedness in general. In the Book of Enoch, the flood is sent specifically because of the watchers and their offspring. The watchers are the cause, the flood is the response. The corruption that they introduced is the corruption that has to be washed away. This is the same logic that runs through the Mesopotamian flood stories, where the flood is a response to a problem that the gods themselves have created. In both traditions, the flood is not so much a punishment of humans as it is a correction of a divine mistake, a reset of an experiment that had gone wrong. And in both traditions, the bridge across the reset is a single righteous man, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, or Zusudra, or Noah, who is warned, who builds the boat, who survives, who carries the seed of the old world into the new one. The names change, the structure does not. We have not yet talked properly about the Nephilim, and no honest discussion of the parallels between the two traditions can leave them out, because the question of the Nephilim is one of the strangest and most disputed corners of the entire ancient Near Eastern imagination. The Hebrew word Nephilim appears only twice in the Hebrew Bible. The first occurrence is in Genesis chapter 6, in the famous passage about the sons of God taking wives from among the daughters of men. There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Hebrew text is compressed almost to the point of incomprehensibility. The Nephilim are mentioned, but they are not explained. They are described as Gibborim, mighty men, and as men of the name. But who they actually were, and what their relationship to the sons of God was, the text leaves almost entirely unstated. The second occurrence is in the Book of Numbers, much later, in a passage about the spies that Moses sends into the land of Canaan. The spies come back and report that they have seen the Nephilim there, the descendants of the original Nephilim, and that next to them, the spies felt like grasshoppers. The implication is one of enormous size. The translation giants is the one that the ancient Greek translators chose when they made the Septuagint, rendering the Hebrew word Nephilim as the Greek gigant, literally earthborn ones. But the Hebrew word Nephilim does not actually mean giants. It comes from the root nephel, which means to fall. The most natural translation of Nephilim is something like the fallen ones. beings who have fallen, or whose origin is in a falling. The size of the Nephilim is implied by other passages, but the name itself is about descent, not stature. The Nephilim are the fallen ones, and what they have fallen from in the framework of the Book of Enoch is the heavens. They are the offspring of beings who descended. The Book of Enoch fills in the gap that Genesis leaves empty. According to 1st Enoch, the Nephilim are the children born from the union of the Watchers and human women. They are hybrids, half from above, half from below, and they inherit the worst characteristics of both sides. They are immensely large, they are immensely strong, they are immensely hungry. And they are, almost from the beginning, a problem that no one knows how to solve. The book describes their growth in language that is almost ecological. At first the text says, "The Nephilim were content with the ordinary fruits of the earth, but the earth could not produce enough to feed them. They began to consume the labour of humans. Then they began to consume the animals. Then the text says they began to consume one another. And then, when even that could not satisfy them, they began to consume the humans themselves." This is, by any standard, a horrifying passage. It is also deeply weird. The Book of Enoch is not generally a horror story, but when it gets to the Nephilim, it slips into a register of something like reportage from the edge of an ecological collapse. Now turn back to the Sumerian and Akkadian sources and ask whether the Nephilim, under whatever name, appear there too. They do, and the parallel is tighter than most modern readers realise. We spoke earlier of the 7 Apkallu who came before the flood, but the Mesopotamian tradition does not stop the Apkallu story at the flood. After the waters receded, the Bet Meseri text tells us 4 more Apkallu appeared. Their names are preserved: Nungal Pirigaldim, Pirigal Nungal, Pirigal Absu, and Lunana. And the text says something about them that catches the modern reader off guard. It says that these 4 post-flood sages were not fully of divine descent. They were of human descent, to Zeriamaluti in the Akkadian phrase, but they had been endowed with wide understanding by the god Ea, Enki's Akkadian name. Later glosses in other Mesopotamian texts describe these 4 as being 2/3 Apkallu, which is to say, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Stop and listen to that ratio. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Because that is exactly the ratio given for Gilgamesh in the opening lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving long narrative poem in human history. The hero of the epic, the king of Uruk, is described, in the first tablet of the text, as being 2/3 god and 1/3 man. The math, on its face, is impossible. You cannot be 2/3 anything by descent unless one of your parents was already mixed in some specific way. And the math only starts to make sense if you are reading it in the light of the Apkallu tradition, if you are understanding Gilgamesh as a being descended from the same kind of hybrid mixing that produced the 4 post-flood sages. And remember, from our reading of the Book of Giants, that Gilgamesh is named there as one of the Nephilim. The 2 traditions, the Mesopotamian and the Enochic, are describing him in exactly the same terms: a being of mixed descent, a being who is partly of the gods and partly of humans, a being who does not fully belong to either world. The Sumerian tradition does not, on the whole, condemn Gilgamesh for this. The Sumerian tradition celebrates him. He is the hero of the longest and most beloved epic in the entire Mesopotamian canon. And yet, and this is the part that almost no popular retelling bothers to mention, the Bet Meseri text also tells us that the 4 post-flood hybrid Apkallu committed transgressions. The text preserves fragments of what they did. One of them, Pirigal Nungal, angered the storm god Adad, with the result that no rain or growth came to the land for 3 years. Another, Pirigal Absu, did something with his seal that angered Enki himself and was struck down. The details are cryptic, but the shape is clear. The 4 hybrid post-flood sages were not fully trustworthy. They did things they should not have done. They brought about consequences that humans and gods alike had to live with. And here is the thing that modern scholars have started to notice. The Scandinavian and Estonian Assyriologists who have worked most closely with the Mesopotamian primeval traditions, Helge Kvanvig and Drafkorn Kilmer Amar Anus, have begun to argue, in increasingly explicit terms, that the 4 post-flood hybrid Apkallu are the Mesopotamian counterparts of the Nephilim. Kilmer made this case in a short but influential article published decades ago. Amar Anus, a specialist in the relationship between Mesopotamian and Jewish traditions, expanded on it in a 2010 essay titled on the beginnings and continuities of omen sciences between Mesopotamia and the ancient world, and in related work on the Watchers tradition published in the Journal for the Study of the Pseudepigrapha, Annas has argued that the Jewish Watchers tradition did not simply borrow Mesopotamian themes in some general way. It borrowed the Apkallu tradition in particular, and it did so by taking the morally ambiguous hybrid figures of the post-flood Apkallu and reinterpreting them as the demonic offspring of the pre-flood Watchers, that is, as the Nephilim. If Annas is right, then the Nephilim of Genesis and 1st Enoch are, in some literal textual sense, the 4 post-flood Apkallu of Mesopotamia seen through a Jewish theological lens. The hybrids of Sumer are the giants of Enoch. The tradition has been transposed, but the beings are the same beings. The ratios, the transgressions, the uneasy standing between the divine and the human, all of it is preserved across the transposition. This is perhaps the most concrete bridge between the two traditions that modern scholarship has been willing to identify. It is not speculation. It is not fringe. It is an argument made by serious Assyriologists in peer-reviewed journals, based on direct textual comparison. And it points toward the same conclusion that the Book of Giants points toward from the Jewish side, that the people who preserved these two traditions were aware at some level that they were talking about the same things. The Sumerian tradition handles the problem of the hybrids by making them partly heroes and partly cautionary tales. The Book of Enoch handles the problem by acknowledging that it cannot be solved at all, that the only response to the existence of the Nephilim is to end them, by making them turn on each other, and then to wash away the world that produced them. These are two different ethical responses to the same underlying observation. The observation is that there were in the deep past beings who were neither fully human nor fully something else, and that their presence in the world was, in some way that we have lost the ability to articulate, a problem. You can read the Nephilim and the hybrid Apkallu as folklore. That is a perfectly defensible reading, but it is worth at least pausing to notice how the same basic figure, the hybrid being, the offspring of an upper and a lower order, the body too large or too strong for ordinary life, keeps appearing in tradition after tradition with the same set of characteristics and the same troubling ratio of mixed descent. It would be very easy, at this point in the night, to keep stacking parallels until the resemblance between the two traditions became so dense that it seemed impossible to escape. It would also be dishonest, because the parallels are not the only thing in the picture. Serious scholars have spent more than a century studying these texts and these connections, and they have come to a range of conclusions, and the range deserves to be represented honestly. So let's slow down before the night gets too late, and look at what the scholars actually say. The most influential modern voice on the Enoch literature is probably the British biblical scholar Margaret Barker. Barker has written extensively on what she calls the older priestly tradition, a strand of Israelite religion that she argues predates the editing of the Hebrew Bible as we now have it, and that preserved elements of the religious imagination that the later editors of the Bible deliberately simplified. In Barker's view, the Book of Enoch is one of the most important surviving witnesses to this older tradition. It preserves things that the Hebrew Bible has trimmed away. Barker's views are not universally shared, and she's sometimes classed as a heterodox voice within biblical studies, but her work has been taken seriously enough to influence a generation of scholars who now read 1st Enoch as a window into a Second Temple Judaism that was far more varied and strange than the later rabbinic tradition would lead anyone to suspect. Another important voice is the American scholar Michael Heiser, who died in early 2023 after a long illness. Heiser's work on what he called the Divine Council worldview reshaped a great deal of recent thinking about the supernatural framework of the Hebrew Bible. Heiser argued that the ancient Israelites did not believe in a single God surrounded by faceless angels. They believed in a single supreme God who was surrounded by an entire council of lesser divine beings, the sons of God of Genesis 6, the holy ones of the Psalms, the heavenly host of the prophetic books. Heiser showed, with a great deal of textual evidence, that this divine council worldview is woven through the Hebrew Bible from beginning to end. In Heiser's reading, the sons of God who descended in Genesis 6 are members of this divine council. They are not metaphors, they are not symbols, they are beings who, within the framework that the ancient Israelites actually believed in, had genuine independent existence. And their actions in Genesis 6, the unauthorized descent, the taking of human wives, the production of hybrid offspring, were genuine transgressions with genuine consequences in a genuinely populated supernatural world. Heiser was a believing Christian as well as a scholar, and his theological commitments shaped his conclusions in ways that not everyone shares. But the framework he describes, the divine council, the sons of God as real members of that council, the parallels between the Israelite and Mesopotamian conceptions of the divine world, is not controversial in mainstream biblical studies. It is widely accepted. Beyond Barker and Heiser, there is an entire scholarly literature on the relationship between the Enochic traditions and the older Mesopotamian sources. Scholars like Helga Kvanvig and Henrik Drawnel have argued, in painstaking detail, that the figure of Enoch himself is patterned on the Mesopotamian figure of Enma-Duranki. Kvanvig's 2011 book Primeval History, Babylonian, Biblical and Enochic, published by Brill in its prestigious supplements to the Journal for the Study of Judaism series, runs to more than 600 pages of dense textual comparison, and it concludes that the Jewish Enoch literature is drawing on Mesopotamian material in a direct and sustained way that goes far beyond vague thematic resemblance. This is the mainstream scholarly position on the relationship between the two traditions. The Enochic literature is borrowing from older Mesopotamian sources, adapting them, repurposing them, and giving them a Jewish theological frame. The parallels are real. The borrowing is more extensive than most ordinary readers realise. Annis, Kvanvig and Drawnel have traced specific Mesopotamian texts to specific Enochic passages. The Book of Giants, as we have seen, names Mesopotamian heroes as Nephilim. The Aramaic of 4Q204 quotes Enoch 1:9 in language that matches the Hebrew of the Book of Jude. The connections run through the entire literary fabric of the Second Temple period. What the mainstream view does not do is take the next step. It does not conclude that the parallels exist because both traditions are preserving a memory of real events. It treats the parallels as a literary phenomenon, as evidence of cultural contact and textual transmission, not as evidence of shared historical experience. And from a strictly methodological standpoint, this is the responsible position. Scholars cannot, with the tools available to them, verify claims about supernatural beings or about events that took place in deep prehistory. They can only study the texts. This is fair, this is honest. But it leaves a residue. Cultural borrowing produces broad similarities. The same general motifs, the same general structures, the same general shapes. It does not always produce the kind of fine-grained agreement that we see in the lists of subjects taught by the Watchers and the Apkallu. It does not produce a Jewish text that names Gilgamesh by name as a Nephilim. It does not produce the ratio of 2/3 divine to 1/3 human in both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Beat Messeri commentary on the post-flood Apkallu. It does not produce the parallel of a seventh patriarch taken up to heaven in both traditions. There is something underneath the borrowing, something that borrowing alone does not fully explain, and underneath all of this, there is the brute fact of what has been lost. The Sumerian language was extinct as a living tongue before the time of Christ. By the time the first European archaeologists arrived in the marshlands of southern Iraq in the 19th century, no one had spoken or read Sumerian for more than 2,000 years. Modern scholars do not know Sumerian the way you know your own native language. They know it the way you know a difficult musical score that you have studied for many years, but that you have never heard performed by someone who lived in the time it was written. The Library of Alexandria was burned. The libraries of the Mesopotamian temples were sacked and rebuilt and sacked again. We have, in our hands today, a fraction of what the ancient world produced, and we do not know how large the fraction is, because we do not know what we have lost. The Book of Enoch itself nearly disappeared from Western memory entirely. If a Scottish traveller had not gone looking for the source of the Nile in 1773, and if a Bedouin shepherd had not thrown a stone into a cave in 1947, we would be having a very different conversation tonight. How many other books like the Book of Enoch existed once and have not come down to us? We cannot know. The silence is part of the answer. What we can say is this: the parallels between the two traditions are real. They are not vague. They involve specific names and specific numbers and specific subjects and specific sequences of events. The mainstream scholarly explanation of literary borrowing accounts for most of them, and the Book of Giants and the Bet Messeri traditions together provide the textual evidence that the borrowing was real. But the residue, the leftover, the thing that keeps people coming back to these texts, is harder to dismiss than the mainstream account sometimes allows. So where does all of this leave us, on a quiet night, with the lights low and the hour late? It leaves us with three possibilities. None of them are comfortable, and none of them are complete, and none of them can be definitively chosen on the basis of the evidence we have. The first possibility is the one the mainstream scholars prefer, and it is the most conservative reading of the evidence. The Book of Enoch borrowed from the Mesopotamian tradition. The borrowing was extensive, direct, and in some places textually explicit, as the Book of Giants shows when it folds Gilgamesh and Humbaba into the Enochic narrative by name. Jewish scribes living in the centuries after the Babylonian exile knew the older Mesopotamian stories and absorbed their structures into their own religious imagination. The parallels between the Watchers and the Anunnaki exist because one tradition is descended from the other. There is no deeper mystery. There is only the long, slow process of cultural transmission. This explanation accounts for most of the parallels. If it is correct, then the question we have been sitting with tonight has an answer, and the answer is literary inheritance. But the first possibility does not quite explain everything. It does not explain why the lists of taught subjects are so nearly identical. It does not explain why the structural sequence of events, descent, teaching, reproduction, judgment, imprisonment, flood, survivor, is preserved with such fidelity. It does not explain the ratio of 2/3 divine to 1/3 human, showing up in both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Beit Meseri commentary on post-flood sages. It does not explain why the seventh antediluvian Apkallu ascends to heaven, and the seventh patriarch from Adam is also taken by God. The second possibility is that both traditions, the Sumerian and the Enochic, are independently preserving the memory of something real, something that happened in a deep prehistoric past, before either tradition had a written language. In this reading, both written versions look alike because they are remembering the same thing. The Sumerian version preserves what we might call the official record told from the standpoint of the established order. The Enochic version preserves the dissenting record, told from the standpoint of an authority that judged the dissent as transgression. Two perspectives, one event. The differences are exactly the kind of differences you would expect when two communities remember the same disturbance from opposite sides of the moral question. The third possibility is the strangest and the quietest of the three. It is that neither tradition fully understood what it was preserving. The scribes who pressed the marks into the wet clay at Nineveh and Nippur and were not eyewitnesses. They were preservers. They were copying material that had come to them through long chains of transmission, in languages that were already old by the time their own civilizations existed. The same is true of the writers of the Book of Enoch. They were working from materials that had been handed down to them, in oral tradition and in earlier written form, and they were doing their best to preserve those materials in the language and the theological framework of their own time. In this reading, the parallels between the two traditions exist because both traditions are doing the same kind of work, the work of preserving something that they themselves did not fully understand, but that they considered too important to lose. The original event, whatever it was, is no longer accessible to us in any direct form. The texts are pointing toward it, the way two telescopes from opposite sides of a valley might point toward the same mountain, but neither telescope can show us the mountain itself. We can only see the pointing. These are the three possibilities. The honest thing to say, after a long evening of reading, is that no one can definitively prove which is correct. The texts are too old, the languages are too damaged, the original events, if there were any, are too far in the past to be reached. The tablets are still being translated. New fragments of cuneiform turn up every year. The Dead Sea Scrolls are still being studied, and whole sections have only been published in the last 20 years. The Ethiopian Christian tradition continues to preserve manuscripts that Western scholars have only partial access to. The work of reading the ancient world is not finished. It will probably never be finished. Every generation of scholars adds something, and every generation finds that the picture is a little more complicated, a little stranger, a little harder to summarize than it had been the generation before. Whatever these texts are describing, we have not finished reading them yet. Before the night closes, there is one more thing worth saying, and it has to do with how far the echo travels. We have been talking all evening about two traditions, the Sumerian and the Enochic, with the Book of Giants as the bridge between them. But the truth is that the echo does not stop with these two. Once you know what you are listening for, you begin to hear it in places you would not have expected. In the Greek tradition, there is the myth of the Titans, an older generation of divine beings who ruled before the Olympian gods, who were defeated in a great war, and who were imprisoned beneath the earth in a place called Tartarus, bound there for eternity by the victorious younger gods. The parallel to the bound watchers of the Book of Enoch is so close that early Christian writers, when they wanted to explain the Book of Enoch to their Greek-speaking audiences, simply translated watchers as titans. The Greek word Tartarus even appears in the New Testament as in the second letter of Peter, in a passage that explicitly describes the binding of the angels who sinned, in language that draws on both the Enochic and the Greek mythological traditions at the same time. In the Greek myth of Prometheus, you find another version of the same shape. Prometheus is a titan who chooses, against the explicit prohibition of Zeus, to steal fire from the gods and give it to humans. The fire is not just literal fire, it is the entire foundation of human technology, the spark of metallurgy, the warmth of the hearth, the light of civilization. For this transgression, Prometheus is bound to a rock and tortured for eternity. The structure is exactly the structure of the Watchers in the Book of Enoch. A divine being, against the will of the highest authority, transmits forbidden knowledge to humanity and is bound and punished for it. In the Egyptian tradition, the Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu during the Ptolemaic period, but preserving what most Egyptologists believe to be much older temple traditions, describe a primordial world in which a group of divine beings descended to a primeval island and established the first sanctuary. The Edfu texts speak of the ancestors, of the seven sages, of a great flood that ended the primordial age, and of a generation of builder gods who came before the human pharaohs and laid the foundations of sacred architecture. The number 7 is the same as the number of the Mesopotamian Apkallu. The function is the same, the framework is the same. The Edfu texts are talking about a different mythology, in a different language, with different names. But the shape of the story, once you strip the names away, is the shape of a descent, a teaching, and a founding. The Mandaean tradition of southern Iraq and western Iran, a small and ancient religion that reveres John the Baptist as its central prophet, preserves in its sacred book, the Ginza Rabbah, a cosmology in which messenger beings called Uthras descend from the world of light to teach the first humans the arts of civilization and the knowledge of the stars. The Mandaean tradition has been preserved in the marshlands of southern Iraq for nearly 2,000 years in almost complete isolation. And yet its founding story, stripped of its unique theological vocabulary, rhymes with the story we have been reading tonight. In the Hermetic literature of late antique Egypt, the god Thoth is said to have descended in primordial time to teach humanity the arts of writing and calculation and the naming of the stars. Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek form of this same figure, was believed by Renaissance scholars to have been a real pre-Mosaic sage. The Hermetic texts attributed to him preserve echoes of the same basic story in a Hellenistic philosophical register. In the Andean tradition of pre-Columbian South America, the god Viracocha is said to have emerged from Lake Titicaca in the primordial time, travelled across the land teaching humans the arts of civilization, and then walked out across the Pacific Ocean to disappear into the west. The Aztec traditions of central Mexico preserved a similar story about Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who came to teach humanity and then departed, promising to return. The oral traditions of several North American nations preserve stories of teachers who descended from the sky and gave the people their first knowledge of agriculture, ceremony, and medicine. None of these parallels are as tight as the parallel between the Sumerian and the Enochic accounts. None of them have the same level of granular detail, and most of them cannot be easily explained by direct cultural contact. The Andean and Aztec traditions, in particular, developed in almost complete isolation from the ancient Near East, but all of them are pointing in the same general direction. All of them are saying, in their different languages and their different theological frameworks, the same basic thing, that knowledge came from somewhere, and that the somewhere was not exactly here, and that the bringers of the knowledge were not exactly us. You can read this as a universal pattern in human storytelling. People everywhere, the argument goes, like to imagine that their civilization was given to them as a gift from above, because the alternative, that they built it themselves out of nothing, is less flattering. Origin myths almost always involve a giver. This is a perfectly defensible reading, and a great deal of comparative mythology takes exactly this position. But notice again the residue. The universal pattern explains why people tell stories about divine teachers in general. It does not explain why two specific traditions, separated by language and geography, tell almost the same story, in almost the same words, with the same named individuals, with the same numerical ratios, with the same throne visions, and with the same seventh patriarch taken to heaven structure. It does not explain the Book of Giants placing Gilgamesh among the Nephilim by name. The universal pattern is part of the answer. It is not by itself the whole answer. This is perhaps the deepest reason that traditions like the Book of Enoch and the Sumerian tablets continue to fascinate people who are not professional scholars. It is not because most readers of these texts believe in ancient astronauts, or in literal angelic descents. It is because the texts themselves carry, in their grain, the unmistakable feeling of preservation, of someone long ago having decided that this story was important enough to keep, and having paid the price to keep it, and having handed it on. That feeling is not something that a rational explanation can fully reach. It is something that you feel when you read the text slowly, in a quiet room, late at night, with no agenda. You are now one of those readers. You have spent an evening with the words. They are now, in some small way, part of your inner landscape. You do not have to do anything with them. They will sit quietly, the way the tablet sits in the museum case and the fragment sits in the sealed container. They will be there when you want to come back to them. That is what old stories do. They wait. They have nothing to prove and nowhere to be. They have already outlasted the people who wrote them, and the people who stopped reading them, and the empires that decided what was worth keeping. They will outlast us too, and the only thing they ask of us, in return for all of that patience, is that we listen now and then, slowly and without hurry, the way we have been listening tonight. Let the night settle. Somewhere in a museum in Oxford or London or Berlin, a Sumerian tablet is sitting in a glass case under low light, the way it has been sitting for more than 100 years. The scribe who pressed those marks into wet clay died 40 centuries ago. The civilization he belonged to is gone. The language he wrote in went silent for 2,000 years, and even now, with all of our scholarship, we know it only the way you know a song you have studied carefully, but never heard sung. The tablet does not care about any of this. It simply continues to exist, the way clay does, with the patience of a substance that has already survived almost everything that could have destroyed it. Somewhere in a climate-controlled archive in Jerusalem, a fragment of papyrus is lying in a sealed container, the way it has been lying for nearly 80 years. It is the same fragment that was pulled out of a clay jar in a desert cave by people who did not, at first, understand what they had found. It contains a few lines of Aramaic. The lines are from the Book of Enoch, the book that gradually disappeared from Western Christianity, the book that was preserved by a single church in a single country, in a single language against every reasonable expectation, until the cave gave up its other copies and the world remembered. And in a third set of cases, spread between Jerusalem and Ammon, and the quiet archives where specialists still work by hand, with magnifying glasses and photographic negatives, there are the fragments of the Book of Giants, the text that bridges the other two, the text that takes the Mesopotamian hero Gilgamesh and places him, by name, in the Aramaic story of the Children of the Watchers, the text that was so important to the community that preserved it that they copied it at least 9 separate times, and buried the copies for safekeeping, and trusted the desert to keep what they could not keep themselves. These 3 sets of objects have outlasted almost everything around them, the empires that rose and fell while they were waiting, the languages that lived and died, the wars and the floods and the long, slow passage of centuries. They are still here. They are still asking the question they have always been asking. They will still be here in the morning, and they will still be asking it tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. You don't have to answer the question tonight. You don't have to answer it ever. The question doesn't need you. The question has already outlasted everyone who ever tried to set it aside, and it will outlast everyone reading this. And that is, in its own quiet way, a kind of comfort. Some questions are not problems to be solved. They are companions to be carried. They walk with you into sleep, and they walk with you back out of it, and they ask nothing of you except that you keep them in mind from time to time, the way you might keep an old friend in mind, without needing to do anything about it. Let your breathing slow. Let the lights go down even further, if they have not already. Imagine the museum room one more time, the clay tablet on the left, the papyrus fragment on the right, and between them, in a third case you had not noticed until now, the scattered pieces of the Book of Giants, the bridge that no one was supposed to find, the text that reached across the gap and named names. 3 cases, 3 witnesses, the dim, even light, the cool, still air, the patience of objects that have survived everything. Imagine that you're standing there alone, and that you have all the time in the world, and that there is no decision you have to make about any of this. There is only the looking, there is only the noticing, there is only the slow, quiet recognition that somewhere in the deep past something happened that 2 completely different civilizations remembered in 2 completely different languages, and that a third text, the one found in the cave, reached across and linked them together. You don't have to know what it was. You don't have to choose between the possibilities. You only have to let the question be there, the way the tablets and the fragments have let it be there, for as long as it has needed to be there. And then you can sleep. The tablets will still be here in the morning, so will the fragments, so will the bridge, so will the question. If this story stayed with you, a quiet like would help others find their way here on a night like this one. If you'd like to keep walking through the old places with me, there is a playlist waiting. More tablets, more caves, more slow doors into the deep past. And if something in this story turned a key for you tonight, I'd love to read what you think in the comments. I read them slowly, the way we read the old texts together. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.